Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. In this session, we will begin our coverage of assessment and intelligence. The session will follow the outline shown, beginning with the question, what is psychometrics? Psychometrics is the field of study concerned with the theory and techniques of psychological measurement. It focuses on the assessment of skills, knowledge, abilities, attitudes, and personality traits. The earliest example of psychometric testing was the Keiju, or Chinese imperial exam. Large empires need an efficient administrative system, and an efficient administrative system requires capable individuals. Accordingly, the Chinese designed these exams to identify the best candidates for civil service positions. Prior to this, people had been appointed based on social rank. There were many versions of the exam. Early versions concentrated on testing knowledge of reading, writing, and philosophy. Later versions assessed broader knowledge, such as mathematics and law. Modern-day bureaucracies still use similar entrance exams. The United Kingdom introduced civil service exams in 1854. The United States introduced civil service exams in 1871, and both countries still use them today. The most influential figure in the history of psychometrics was Sir Francis Galton, sometimes known as the father of psychometrics. Sir Francis Galton was a 19th century British polymath. One of his many interests was the assessment of mental ability. He designed some of the first mental tests of sensory discrimination, creating many ingenious instruments to assess visual, auditory, and touch acuity, as well as reaction time. In 1885, over 8,000 people paid to have their abilities measured in his anthropometric laboratory, which he set up at the London International Health Exhibition. In addition to collecting data in his laboratory, he was the first person to collect data using questionnaires and surveys. He used these to gather data about people's family histories. He also invented statistical methods to analyze his data. He invented standard deviation, a method of quantifying how spread out data are around their mean. And in 1888, he independently discovered the concept of correlation. Correlation is the concept that two measures can be statistically related. Galton discovered this concept after noticing that there was a relationship between people's height and their forearm lengths. It should be noted that correlation was first discovered in 1846 by Auguste Bravais, a French physicist, but Galton was unaware of his work. Today, there are hundreds of psychometric tests. However, they are all designed with certain features in common. All formal assessment procedures are standardized. They are the same for everyone. Anyone taking a test does so under exactly the same conditions. Everyone is given the same instructions, everyone is given the same test, everyone is given the same amount of time, and everyone is scored in the same way. Formal assessment procedures are norm referenced. Results indicate an individual's relative standing. An individual score will reveal what percentage of people he or she does better than. Thirdly, all procedures are designed to be reliable. Their results are consistent. Tests will produce similar results when repeated measures are made. There are three methods of assessing test reliability. The test-retest method involves administering the same test twice, separated by a relatively long interval of time, and comparing the results. The parallel forms, or alternate forms method, involves administering two tests that contain equivalent but differently worded questions and comparing the results. The split half method involves administering one test and comparing performance on one half of the questions to the other half of the questions. Finally, tests are designed to be valid. Tests measure what they are intended to measure. There are several types of validity. Base validity is the extent to which the test appears to measure what it is intended to measure. It is assessed just by looking at the questions. A test of mathematical ability would have good face validity if it contained numerical questions. Content validity is the extent to which the questions address all aspects of the phenomenon under consideration. An employment test would have good content validity if it contained questions about all of the skills related to the job. Concurrent validity is the extent to which the test matches results from other existing tests. A new general knowledge test would have good concurrent validity if it produced results similar to an existing general knowledge test. Predictive validity is the extent to which the test accurately forecasts expected behavior. For example, the SAT has good predictive validity because it does a reasonable job at predicting college performance. Construct validity is the extent to which a test measures what we already know about an abstract notion, such as intelligence, self-esteem, or motivation. A test of intelligence would have good construct validity if it produced higher scores for teenagers than preschoolers, as we know that intelligence increases over the early years of life. Consider this situation and answer the questions. A valid test measures what it is supposed to measure. Timing how long it takes to sort letters does measure postal ability, so the test is valid. A reliable test produces consistent results. If you took this test numerous times, then your results would not be the same each time. You would improve with practice. So the test is not reliable. Now consider this situation and answer the questions. As we have said, a valid test measures what it is supposed to measure. Measuring the size of people's hands and fingers does not measure their postal ability, so the test is not valid. A reliable test produces consistent results. If your hands and fingers were measured several times, then the results would be the same each time, so the test is reliable. The second question that this session will address is, what is intelligence? There are many definitions of intelligence. For the purpose of this class, intelligence will be defined as the capacity to perform cognitive tasks. For example, the capacity to learn, reason, remember, understand, create, and solve problems. That is, intelligence is a person's mental ability. The third question that this session will address is, what are intelligence tests? Intelligence tests are examinations used to quantify a person's capacity to perform cognitive tasks. They are methods of measuring people's mental ability. The first intelligence test was developed in France at the turn of the last century by Alfred Binet and his colleague Théodore Simon. The French Education Department wanted to identify children who struggled in the classroom so that these children could be given remedial work. The task of identifying such children was given to Binet and Simon. Accordingly, they developed a battery of 30 test items. Children were awarded 1 point for each task that they performed successfully. The items ranged in difficulty from very easy tasks, such as visually tracking a candle flame, gripping objects, and identifying edible things, through moderately difficult tasks, such as defining objects, repeating sentences, and comparing objects, up to hard tasks, such as working out what the time would be if the big and small hands on the clock were reversed, or defining abstract terms such as sadness or weariness. One of the harder questions was the paper cutting exercise shown above. If you took a piece of paper, folded it in half and folded it again, and then cut a triangle as shown, the pattern that you would see is the pattern shown in example C. An individual's results on the Binet-Simon scale were reported as a mental age. A mental age is the typical age at which children achieve a particular score. For example, the typical 7-year-old might score 10 out of 30. So if a child scored 10 out of 30, then their mental age would be 7. They would be performing at the level of the typical 7-year-old. Children could then be classified as being advanced if their mental age was higher than their actual age, normal if their mental age was the same as their actual age, or retarded if their mental age was lower than their actual age. It should be noted that the word retarded was not considered offensive in 1905. The Binet-Simon scale proved highly effective, and similar tests were soon adopted in other countries. Lewis Terman, a psychologist working at Stanford University, adapted the Binet-Simon scale for use in the US. He translated the test items from French into English, and he altered some of the test items. For example, he asked US children to define typical American objects rather than typical French objects. And he asked US children to think of words that rhymed with English words rather than French words. The most notable change that Terman made was to the way that results were reported. The results of the Stanford Binet test are reported as a ratio IQ. Any result of an intelligence test is referred to as IQ. In 1912, William Stern invented what is known as ratio IQ. Ratio IQ is calculated by dividing a child's mental age by their actual age and multiplying by 100. Ratio IQ is the ratio of a child's mental age to their chronological age multiplied by 100. The Stanford Binet test has had many revisions. The 5th revision was released in 2003, and it is still a popular way of assessing mental capacity. The latest version can also be used to assess adolescent and adult capability as well as child capability. Another popular intelligence test is the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. The test was developed by David Wechsler, who worked at the Bellevue Hospital in New York. Wechsler believed that intelligence was too complex to be summarized by just one score. He believed that the Binet scale items were not suited to the testing of adults. And he believed that ratio IQ scores made no sense for adults. He believed IQ was constant throughout early and middle adulthood and then declined in old age. Accordingly, his test differed markedly from the Stanford Binet test. The WAIS has 4 subscales. Some items test verbal comprehension. For example, what does kill 2 birds with 1 stone mean? Some items test perceptual reasoning. For example, if you look at this block test, you would have to decide which block goes in which position to create the shape. Some items test working memory. For example, if you were briefly shown a sequence of letters and numbers, you might be then asked to recall that sequence, putting the letters in alphabetical order and the numbers in numerical order. Finally, some items test processing speed, how quickly people can reason. For example, you might be shown an array of objects and be asked to identify a particular object as quickly as possible. At the end of the test, individuals get a score on each of these 4 components, as well as an overall score. These results are reported as deviation IQs. A deviation IQ is a measure of how far an individual differs from the average. The WAIS is calibrated so that the average person scores 100, with 68% of people scoring between 85 and 115, 95% of people scoring between 70 and 130, and 99% of people scoring between 55 and 145. The last topic that we will look at in this session is the ethics of intelligence testing. Intelligence tests can be put to many uses. People tend to find some of these uses more acceptable than others. For example, most people think that it is morally acceptable to test children's IQ in order to help the most in need. The Binet-Simon scale was used by the French Special Needs Commission for this purpose. Most people think that it is morally acceptable to test IQ in order to determine college admittance. The SAT and ACT are used for this purpose by thousands of colleges. Some people think it is morally acceptable to test adult IQ in order to restrict immigration. In 1924, the US Immigration Restriction Act mandated that all immigrants should be given an IQ test on arrival, and anyone failing the test should be denied entrance. Almost nobody thinks that it is morally acceptable to test IQ in order to determine who can reproduce. Unfortunately, the 1927 Buck versus Bell Supreme Court ruling legalized enforced sterilization of the feeble-minded across the US. IQ tests were administered to many institutionalized people, and over 65,000 people were sterilized against their will.